In my opinion, philosophy really has to do with the problem of relating same and other. In the history of philosophy, philosophers have been primarily concerned with what has been called the question of being. The question stated by Aristotle is as the question that was, is now, and always will be, ti ta on. That is, tis esti ousia. What is that which is? Namely, what is beingness? And throughout the history of Western thought, you have had philosophers giving a variety of answers to this question. By saying that being is the one, by saying that being is energeia, energy, being is eidos, being is the idea, being is actuality, it's substantia, being is will, being is love, and so forth. A whole variety of philosophers have talked about this question in a way that almost might seem like a great game, because every philosopher comes up with some new thing to say. So much so that we've gotten to the point where it's hard, where you might imagine, or you might say that it's hardly possible to think of any new thing to say about what being is. As a matter of fact, modern philosopher Martin Heidegger actually said that in a sense metaphysics has come to an end. Metaphysics, understood as the study of being in the traditional sense, is over. And he points to certain very important passages in Nietzsche, where Nietzsche refers to the question of being and sort of its last little traces in the Western mind, and how it's just sort of evanescent and it's just about ready to disappear. And as a matter of fact, Martin Heidegger considers the entire purpose of his philosophical career reawakening an interest in this question, the question of being, yet he recognizes that there is something that has been completed in Western thought. And his whole task, the task he assigns himself is to somehow reawaken an interest in this question in a new way. So in other words, if metaphysics has been designated or understood in some way as the study of being and the answers to the question, what is being, then Heidegger believes that in some way that the totality of metaphysics has come to a kind of conclusion, because we have to dig deeper. That doesn't mean we're not going to be philosophers. It means that we're not just going to continue to participate in the same game. The game being, well, what do you think being is? Now, again, let's go back to what's the connection between the celestial phenomena and the philosophical questioning. The celestial phenomena are articulated in terms of the problem of the relating of the same and the other. The diurnal motion being the motion of the same and the ecliptic motion being the motion of the other. I maintain that the heart of the philosophical enterprise consists of trying to deal with the problem of relating the same and the other. I've made this statement in numerous talks. This is the problem, so that we don't sell ourselves short, so that we don't conceptualize the same as the other or conceptualize the other as the same. And I've done my very best to show the paradoxes that result in trying to relate the same to the other in any manner whatsoever. And I won't repeat those right now. Now, in fact, I believe that the presentation that I've given here of the relationship of the signs to the planets via the idea of familiarization is in fact the solution, or a solution, or at least a tentative attempt at a solution to that problem. And that's why I believe that this investigation that we're doing has not only astrological significance, but it has philosophical significance. Alternatively, and I've mentioned this in some of my other talks, we could say that if one were even to try to study philosophy historically, insofar as the engine behind philosophy itself, or philosophy as it's unrolled itself through time, the engine behind this is what is the interacting of the same and the other in the minds of philosophers, and how they have sold themselves short or not sold themselves short. However great they would be, they've all somehow been subject to a kind of destiny of the Western mind, a kind of history, because philosophy has its own history. The question is, how do we understand that history? If indeed philosophy has to do with the question of the same and the other, if in fact celestial phenomena and astrology has to do with the relating of the same and the other, it also means that we could study the history of thought, particularly the history of philosophy, in terms of something astrological. And I've made allusions before to the work of Kant, published right at, almost the very same month as the discovery of Uranus. Schelling's work, lectures in the 1840s, published almost concurrently with the discovery of Neptune, and Heidegger in conjunction with the discovery of Pluto. Now, similarly, one could study the rest of the history of thought, in the history of philosophical thought in this manner, although there are certain problems involved with possible chronological distortions. But in principle, this could be done, because celestial phenomena are the relating of the same and the other, and philosophers are concerned with that. So presumably there is an astrological overtone or an astrological significance to the way in which philosophers themselves have given their opinions and done their work historically. There should be some meaning to that astrologically. At some point I will give a lecture on that very topic. And by the way, you would see from this emphasis of mine that I would think that the study of the sort of unveiling of being, if you want to consider that the object of the philosopher, by philosophers would have more significance for historical astrological study than the simple study of cultural phenomena. And I'm not denigrating that. It's very interesting, the way people identify, all the things that happen once Uranus is discovered and so forth. But I would think that the defining features, the sort of nerve of that history could best be traced through the philosophical developments rather than the cultural developments, for the simple reason that the philosophical developments have immediately to do with the same and the other. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set up an analogy that will help us find a way in which we might, in some sense, be able to use the celestial grammar as a guide to philosophical inquiry, because philosophers have to use logos. They have to think, in other words. And whether we're a Greek and we think that thinking is logos internalized, or whether we're a modern person and we think that logos is nothing but an expression of our thought, doesn't really matter at this point. Basically, we need to understand logos in natural languages, the languages that philosophers use, and how these might in some way be influenced by the celestial grammar, or guided by the celestial grammar. So you see, we have a very ambitious program here in mind. The astrological world not only needs to co-opt modern science and modern semantics and modern mathematics and modern psychology. Notice I put it that way. Astrology has to co-opt psychology, not the other way around. But it has to in some way co-opt the study of philosophy. Now, remember that in the motions of the two celestial spheres, the diurnal motion of the same, the ecliptic motion, the motion of the other describes a path around the celestial sphere, which is the belt of the zodiac. Now that we haven't talked about the relating of those two spheres as a whole. In other words, we haven't talked about the whole zodiac. We primarily talked about the zodiac broken up into 12 parts. We haven't really talked about its significance as a totality, as an entire belt defined by the motion of the other against the celestial sphere. We haven't addressed that question. But you should know from the allusions I've made to Plato's Sophist and other writings by Plato that Plato regarded being as rest and motion together, stasis and kinesis together, somehow at the same time. And the celestial sphere in the sensible world represents the motion of the same. It is not absolutely stationary because it rotates, according to ancient astronomy. However, that rotation is absolutely uniform. Plato in the Timaeus regards this rotation as being the best sensible copy or imitation of stasis, understood as something that belongs to the eidetic realm. Now, I'm not trying to commit myself to a Platonic view. I'm just simply giving an exposition of his position. So the celestial sphere, even though it moves with uniformity, and furthermore, the stars on the celestial sphere are, as far as Plato knew, and for all intents and purposes, fixed. So there is stasis with the fixed stars. Remember, stasis is not simply, rest in the sense you lie down and your muscles go completely slack and you fall asleep. Stasis is standing firm. And we mentioned that numerous times throughout this talk. whereas the motion of the other, the circle of the other, has to do with the phenomena of change, and that is the circle within which the various planets move. So what we have is, in the global interaction of the circle of the same with the circle of the other, we have the sphere of the same with the sphere of the other, we have the zodiacal band defined. Plato says that the motion of the same can be identified with stasis, and the motion of the other can be identified with change. Therefore, and he then further says that being is rest and motion together. We could infer from this that the zodiacal band in some way represents being. Do you follow the logic? In other words, being in this model, which is really more than a model in some way, is the entire zodiacal band.
It's with planets.
With the planets on it, yes. But we're talking primarily about the global motion of the other against the celestial sphere, marking out the zodiacal band, which is the, you might say, here we're talking about we're not moving inward from the celestial sphere and the global motion of the other to bring the same and the other together in terms of sign and planet. We're talking about their fundamental first interaction, you might say, okay, before we come to a complete logos. In other words, this is still at a somewhat broad and global or general level. This is being. We'll call this being with a capital B. Okay? So that's being. It equals the zodiacal belt, or the zodiac, as a whole. Now, the analysis that we conducted showed us how to relate portions of that zodiacal belt to the planets. And this is where we discovered the guiding central principle of familiarity, oikeiosis. We also might use a word like appropriation. The signs appropriate the planets. The signs make them familiar to themselves, and they become more what they are. They remain the same. They become even more same, because remember, they're tied to the circle of the same. And that we were characterizing as the fundamental logos-like activity, and furthermore, we associated that with Mercury as the ruler of logos. Now, what we're going to talk about here is more the whole zodiacal belt, being. And what significance that has, because there's no indication in our celestial grammar per se that being does anything to the planets, as all the planets or anything. It is the individual signs that have familiarity with the individual planets. But being is something that philosophers are very much concerned with. This is what philosophers, as I said, have spent their whole careers doing, trying to answer the question, what is being, in some way? Now, we as individual thinkers, as individual human beings, are in some way subject to the same faculty, or let's say subject to the same desires, expectations, intentions, acts of will, activities, and so forth, as the planets are in their essences, which according to the Valence passage has to do with when the planets themselves are being familiarized by the signs. That's when the planets become most really what they are. Remember that from that quote? We ourselves act in a similar manner. In other words, the planets move the way they move out of desire for these ideas which are identified with the different signs of the zodiac and also the extra-zodiacal constellations when we bring in the issue of the decans. So we as men, as human beings, have a kind of role similar to the planets. So we have being as a zodiacal belt, and here we have man. But in our discussion so far, all we have related is individual signs to planets. And we have linked these with the verbal with the idea of a kind of middle-voiced verbal familiarity. This has been our juncture. This has been the logos function. But here we're talking about the signs as a whole, the zodiacal belt, and we are also talking about man as sort of the stand-in for the planets, because after all, we act in a way that is similar to the way the planets act. In other words, we act out of various motives. We think that something would be good for us, so we pursue it, and so forth. The question is whether the relationship between man and being, philosophically speaking, can be explicated in terms of an analogy with the relation between the signs and the planets. In other words, whether we can learn from the grammar that we explicated here, the relating of the signs to the planets, whether we can learn what we as philosophers should do in terms of being as the object of the philosophical quest, and man and us as philosophers, or man. What is the relationship here? So that's what I would like to begin to talk a little bit about. Now, are there any questions, first of all, on the analogy? Or any comments on the analogy so far? Do you find it vague?
Is this a proposition like man is to being as
roughly
planets are to signs?
Yes. Man is to being as planets are to signs. Now, philosophers, above all, should use language properly. I don't think that this is a bad statement. As a matter of fact, if they don't use language properly, they're probably going to be bad philosophers. By using language properly, I do not mean good spelling, good grammar in the ordinary sense of the word. I don't mean... What I mean is a real use of language that in its own domain is at least an imitation and possibly a very fine example of familiarization, which is what related the signs to the planets in the first place. Remember, that was logos. This is our logos. Now, you might ask yourself the question, as I think I said earlier, how do we experience a simple sentence like, a man runs? How do we really, really, truly experience that as logos? I've always regarded that as the very hardest thing to do. It's much easier to experience a syllogism. It's much easier to experience what happens with the signification or pointing that belongs to an individual word. The hardest thing of all, in my opinion, is to really experience what happens when you join a noun to a verb. And if you think that's a simple thing, just remember everything we've talked about here, how many steps we went through in order to try to say what that real linkage, at least ideally, was. So maybe, for the most part, human beings, when they use language, do not use it with such consciousness. Do not use it in a way in which they would fully experience that kind of connection, in any way resembling the connection between the signs of the planets via familiarization. Maybe they don't. But shouldn't the philosopher? And shouldn't we in some way strive to do this? Not only that, I maintain, even if we were able to do this with consciousness and deliberation, even in our everyday activities, even when we're talking about I have to pay the bills and the dog is barking and all these kinds of things, it would make us better astrologers. Because we would experience that connection. And certainly astrologers want to do more than just simply have a mechanical set of rules that they read. There's clearly some element to the astrological practice that requires not guessing, but it requires a kind of intuitive act. There's a certain place in which that intuitive act has to be made. Now, modern astrologers rely very heavily on that. And some of them are very good, but they can't teach it. Classical astrology is far more methodical. The astrological methods that we have discovered so far from both Greek and classical medieval texts take you much further. They take you much further, but still you've got to do the read at some point. Okay, which basically is an act of trained intuition. I also would go so far, I've said this in other talks, that there's another feature to the Greek astrological techniques, which is the techniques themselves, as they are being used by the astrologer, are also designed to bring the astrologer to the point where he can take that intuitive jump better. He's better prepared. In other words, they not only get you further, but they prepare you in the very course in the very course of using them. So I would very much commend the grammatical understanding that we have been talking about here, if for no other reason, so that you could become better astrologers, and the way to practice that is actually in your daily life. Just try to really become aware of simple sentences, hard though that may be. And I doubt for the most part whether any of us is able to experience this more than once or twice, a day, if we're lucky, and maybe not that at all. It doesn't happen that often, but once you have that experience, it's a very shaking kind of experience, and you will know that something happened, something very fundamental. I'm not saying that this is enlightenment. As a matter of fact, I do not consider it enlightenment. I consider it the Western counterpart to enlightenment, which in a sense serves a completely opposite function. Logos is meant, according to the classical tradition, and I agree with this, to lead to a kind of unconcealment of beings. Whereas the enlightenment path is supposed to lead the person or is supposed to let in the light. These are two completely different activities. Perhaps ultimately they point in the same direction. If one is fully enlightened, he is also, by virtue of that, able to unconceal beings. But the Western path, in my opinion, has always been how to properly unconceal beings. This is why the Western world has been so obsessed with science. Even if science has gone totally off the rails and has completely run amok. Yeah, that's a good word. Run amok. Yet that is even still its intention, whether it realizes that or not. I would also maintain that it's quite possible that should a person attain the condition of perfect logos, in which even in his everyday life he was fully aware of what was going on between noun and verb. In other words, he was constantly participating in the unconcealment of being. He would also end up letting in the light, and for all intents and purposes be enlightened. So these are two very different paths. And I don't have a whole lot of patience with people who repudiate the Western path. Personally, I don't. This is just rank opinion on my part. Because I don't think it has been pursued to its end, and I don't think it has been pursued with full consciousness. Partly because I believe the individual sciences and philosophy as well have lost contact with astrology, which is one of my main themes.